If I start like hobbling ever so slightly, I want to apologize ahead of time. I have this. So in the plantar fascia of your foot, which are sort of like the bones that kind of run along your hand, those are meant to absorb a lot of pressure. I stopped running this last week because of a different issue, like an Achilles tendon issue that I was kind of worried about. And since doing that, I noticed that a lot of other things should have been dealt with. Last time I stopped running was like September. And so, different things kind of come up. So if my foot like locks up and I cramp up or something and I start doing that, it's not for dramatic effect. But, and I shouldn't have said that. I could have used that for dramatic effect. Yeah, anyway, it's not for dramatic effect. It's actually like, something's going on. So anyway, just disclaimer. I have a story to tell you today. It's a story that I've been researching kind of throughout this week. This is kind of a direction I didn't know I was going to go today. So kind of, I guess bear with me. We're in James 5, by the way, today. We're in James 5. We're at almost the end of James, which now we need to figure out what we're doing after James. So if you have any books of the Bible that you'd like me to cover that I haven't covered already, I'm taking suggestions. Leviticus? All right. I'll add it to my list. I was thinking this summer of doing a longer study. And then I woke up one morning and I was doing my Bible study and I was thinking like, I should do Revelation. And I went, wow, that's wildly deep. Yeah, I don't know if I'm that optimistic about my chances on that one, but James has been fun. I especially like the fact that when you're dealing with James, he always covers 2 or 3 themes in every single chapter that he goes through. So you can always kind of tie a few things together. And the very end is pretty cool because it actually, everything at the end just ties itself together so nicely because he was writing a letter. And even though it's been translated over and over again, you can still get the continuity as he's tying this letter together. The story I'm about to tell you today, though, is not about James at all, actually. We're not starting with James at all. The story I'm about to tell you is the story of an interviewer who in 2012 came forward with a previously undocumented interview that he did with a very famous singer. And as he was walking through Nashville that day, about 15 miles out of Nashville, he was walking down this really rich and lavish path to an extremely huge house with about 3 stories and about 80 acres of timber behind it. He walked up to the door and he rang the doorbell, and he thought that was kind of weird that at a house this large you didn't have someone just meet you outside, but he rang the doorbell and the singer himself came to the doorway. The singer, he noticed, although he was immediately aware that he was standing in the presence of someone that he had idolized for years, this singer was a shell of the man he had once been. I said before that he had 80 acres of woods nearby behind his house. He was talking about how he got the house and the fact that once he got it, he immediately built a 2-story little cabin in the 80 acres behind the house. And the interviewer said, why would you do that? Is it to write songs, or are you writing a new album back there? And he said, well, it's not really about that. You see, I have to have this house because it reminds me of where I've been, and it reminds me of the need to pray daily about where I'm going so I don't fall off the wagon. And the interviewer, as he was sitting there, kind of thought about this and thought, that's probably a good idea, because as he was thinking back, the stories about this singer are absolutely insane. You might know that rock stars and the various lifestyles that they live more like feral animals than humans. I mean, they are shuttled into our reality one minute using, fanfare and giant planes and aircraft and private tour buses and limousines pulled up to this venue. And then as soon as they're done with the performance, they're just whisked away and we don't see them again. For a brief little time, if you buy that expensive ticket to that concert, you'll see the singer in all of their glory just once. And then they're whisked away out of your life. But they live a crazy life, and the stories about this guy were crazy. I won't go into a lot of them because, honestly, a lot of them you can't really talk about at church. But the interviewer, as he was sitting across from this famous singer, asked him, thinking back over so many years of performing and playing music for different audiences, what's your one takeaway? And the singer remarked with one sentence, "You know, I was truly evil." His wife was sitting there, and she corrected him and said, "You know, your spirit wasn't evil, but the things that you did were truly evil." He had been arrested many times. In fact, many of the songs that this singer wrote were about being locked up in county jails and various places like that. He had many documented substance abuse problems. In fact, he was once arrested in Mexico for suspicion of being on one certain substance, and then when the authorities arrested them, they found an entirely different substance inside of his guitar case. In fact, filling the guitar case almost to explosion. There was not even a guitar in the guitar case. There was enough, in fact, to get him on a distribution charge. However, this singer has sold 90 million records to this day in 2019 worldwide, and is regarded as one of the most influential artists of our day and age, and in the world, if not his genre. But like he said, I was truly evil. If you go to James 5:1, it's a warning to what's in my Bible, the footnote is rich oppressors. And as I was researching this a little bit more, scholars kind of think that James was talking about people that were persecuting those that they worked for. And people not in the church that he was necessarily talking about, but like we talked about before, James doesn't talk to one church. Paul does that. Paul goes and he talks to one community of believers and says, hey, here's what you're doing, here's what you could be doing better, here's what God is delighting in, here's what God is not delighting in. But James does not do that. James talks to the body of believers as a whole, because James was trying to bridge the gap, as it were, between the teachings of Jesus and now what do we do with that in real life? How do we go about living now that we know that this man was buried, rose again, and ascended to heaven? Now what do we do with that? And so James is talking about probably even people, some scholars surmise, people that the believers, the body of believers that he was talking to actually worked for. And they were called rich oppressors in my Bible. It says in verse 1, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire." Isn't that a crazy image? It will eat your flesh like fire. "You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Now in my Bible, innocent one, you might have already thought to yourself, oh, that's talking about Jesus. Well, in my Bible, it's not actually capitalized. And I looked at that a little bit further, and not really talking about Jesus per se, but by innocent one, it's also referring to the martyrdom that was happening of Christians all around as James is talking and James is witnessing to people. And he's starting to notice that the Roman government and all the governments associated with Rome are definitely not in the best interest of the new faith of Christianity that's popping up. And while rich people aren't going out of their way to hunt down Christians and murder them, Rome was ruled by two different, we call them presidents now, but they were consuls back in the day. And this is something I was talking about with my class. Imagine this for a second, no matter which side of the political argument you're on. If, for example, we voted in the last presidential election, and we came up with two presidents, and it was Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Imagine that for a second. Just imagine that, just for a second, because if you keep imagining that, the possibilities just go, whoa. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if we had had two presidents that opposed each other like that? Rome did that. Rome had the First Republic, but they also had two consuls governing Rome during the Republic. Now this kind of became a problem, as you would notice, because both consuls, by the way, our modern president has veto power over any law that's about to be passed. He can say nope, and then Congress gets to vote and overturn that if they want to. But both of these consuls in Rome had veto power over each other too. And so if one of them opposed the law and said, we don't like that law, I don't like that, check, no. The other one could actually come over and say, but I like that law. And it could go back and forth as long as it needed to. And the only thing that would technically save Rome is if both of these men were called off to be generals, because actually they needed military experience and they were obligated to be generals in times of war. And so often what happened, we think, is that Rome would declare war against somebody or cause an uprising, perhaps, and go, oh, look, we need to squash this uprising. Hey, you two people that are fighting, why don't you go over and, help out and stuff. That way the country could actually run in place of having these consuls over. That's how chaotic this thing was. And so as James is talking, he's not only talking to the rich people amongst the believers that are actually believers, but he's talking about the corrupt system in Rome. And he's thinking, he's looking at that and going, guys, what are you doing? I mean, your life seems to be this lavish and luxurious thing, but it doesn't even make sense. And all the things that you have received for yourselves and from ruling these people and things and all of the taxes you've collected, what's that ever going to get you in the long run? Going back to the story I was researching, as the interviewer continued looking across the room at this aging singer, he noticed that his voice had decayed. A voice that had once been one of the greatest baritone voices in American music and had just changed an entire genre, and actually some people think created a genre. That voice was about gone. And if you listen to the last records that he ever made, it's different than it used to be. It's completely gone and just destroyed. He hadn't taken care of his body either. He was suffering from many medical issues. But here was the shell of a man living, like James was talking about, in this giant mansion with pictures and awards and accolades and records and gold records and bronze records hanging all over the walls. And in fact, many of the records that he created had gone gold. In fact, one of the best known live albums in history was recorded by this guy, and actually that had gone gold too. But the reason he had actually had to record that album was because his life was in turmoil. Despite all of the luxury and all of the things that he was accumulating throughout his career, bookers for different venues had started to say, no, we don't want this singer at our venue. And it wasn't anything to do with, the other rock stars you might have heard of in history where they'd go and trash a place and everything like that. No, that wasn't it at all. This singer would sometimes arrive unable to play, unable to sing, unable to carry a tune in a bucket, and unable to stand up there and actually perform and play his instrument. He sometimes, in fact, had to be propped up on stage, and there's different pictures of him actually being propped up and sat down on stage on a stool so that he wouldn't just fall over. This live album, the greatest live album, I think, in history, actually was recorded because they couldn't even get him into a studio. When he came into a studio, he would not bring any original material. He would simply be riding on the wealth and prestige that preceded him from all of his record sales, and he'd go, oh, I'll just write the album when I'm there. So he would come in, and finally, thousands of dollars later for paying record executives and people to sit there and record him, and technicians and the whole nine, and bandmates, we wouldn't have a single song, and everybody would have to go home. And so finally, his manager said, why don't we just, organize a concert for the guy, and maybe we'll just record him. And it turned out to be a huge success. Despite the amount of talent this man had, he could have done so much more with it. And later in his life, he reflected on a life that had spiraled out of control. His later records carry a sense of pain and suffering and abysmal hurt, and just the amount of suffering that he had caused people and the amount of suffering that he had caused himself. He was raised actually by a family that went to church every day. They were Baptists, and even though they went to church every day, they raised him in the church, and he attended Sunday school. He still battled back and forth with his faith versus his wealth. And I think it's really interesting that the Bible talks about money more than any other subject ever. And this man definitely lived that life. He had extreme wealth, but at the same time, he just couldn't hold it together on and off of the stage. Eventually, though, in 1988, there was an altar call. This man had gone back to his childhood church and was attempting to get his life back in order. He was finally back at home with his wife. He wasn't touring anymore. He was attempting to reconnect with the relationship with his son that had been broken. And the pastor, what he said in the interview was the pastor stood up and said, "Hey, does anyone want to recommit their life to God?" And lo and behold, he saw this singer stand up, and his eyes grew wide as he realized who he was and went, "Oh my goodness, this singer is in the house today." And he walked up and accepted Jesus for about the fourth time. But God never gave up on this singer. Throughout his music, although it has an outlaw flair to it, there are different songs with a gospel theme too. He struggled with his addictions, and he struggled with the fact that money to him was such a driving force, and the ability to create a legacy was such a driving force, but at the same time, God was more powerful, and he struggled with it. And I think that's the beauty of it, the fact that he struggled with it. In verse 7, it says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door." Skipping toward verse 13, it says, "Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone amongst you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven." If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. It's not something you do. It's something you get. It's something you receive. This singer had one of the most influential men in history praying for him. A man named Billy Graham was praying for this man. And Billy Graham had been, of course, on his crusades for years and years by the time 1988 had come along, and he heard about this altar call, and he said, "Thank the Lord, this guy has come back." He had been praying for him ever since he met him first, in the 60s, in fact, and tried to strike up a friendship with this singer, but of course, with all the craziness around it, was unable to. In fact, the singer, would kind of go back and forth. At times, he would come up to Billy Graham at a crusade and say, "I was just in town. I just wanted to see you. I really admire all the things that you're saying." And later, he would record a couple gospel tracks or something for Billy Graham to use. And then later, he would go off to his wild life of partying and everything like that. And finally, he would come back, and Billy Graham never gave up on this guy. Never gave up. As the interviewer, this was not a Christian interview, by the way. This is in Rolling Stone magazine. As the interviewer sat across from this famous man, he said, "Billy Graham offered me a way through a door, and I kept stopping at the edge of the door. I would never open the door and go in, but Billy Graham kept showing me the door again and again. He would keep calling me. He would keep writing me letters, and overall, like James was talking about, he would keep praying for me. This man never gave up on me." So in 1988, the singer accepted God again. Billy Graham immediately called him a couple weeks after. Well, not immediately, then a couple weeks after. And he said, "Why don't you come along with me? Why don't you play at some crusades?" The singer said, What are you talking about? Haven't you heard my music? I can't play at your crusades." Billy Graham said, "It's okay. You don't have to play any of your old material. I know you're tired of that anyway. Why don't you play some hymns?" Billy Graham shipped a book of hymns. The ones that he wanted were bookmarked to his house in Nashville. The singer sat down and he said it was the most intimidating thing sitting down opening that hymnal. Because he said, "I was in the presence of songs that actually meant something." And he said, "All the songs I ever wrote only caused me pain." So he opened that hymnal and he began to rehearse. He began to practice. His band wouldn't practice with him because his band we're not Christians. They kind of viewed this whole thing as, "Oh, all right, you'll come back to us eventually. You got to go do this thing, right? You're just feeling guilty." But the singer was changed. Throughout the 90s, the singer didn't really record much. There were a few best of albums, of course, produced, but he continued to record and play for Billy Graham throughout his crusades, became great friends with his son Franklin Graham. And now, this was about in 2003, before the singer's death. This interviewer was sitting across from him and said, "Wow, so what would your final word be for someone that went through the struggle that you went through?" And the singer kind of said something interesting. Before I tell you what it is, I want you to go back to verses here. In verse 17, it says, "Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their ways will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins." Let's read that again. "Whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins." This singer today is not regarded as a great gospel singer. He's not even regarded as a great Christian, although people all know about his faith. They want to embellish the lifestyle that he lived before, that he was the outlaw singer, that he sang songs for the common man. But later in his life, things changed. The singer began to participate in prison reforms. He thought to himself, I need to go play at these prisons because these men are being treated, even though they are convicted. I have sympathy for them because I was there with them, and I pray that they would come to faith as I have come to faith. He was asked later also to talk about the albums that he made during the end of his career, and he said, if anyone were to listen to the last 5 albums, there was a series, 5 albums that I made, I wish it would be the drug dealers that supplied me. And the interviewer was kind of taken aback and said, what do you mean by that? And as he sat across from Johnny Cash said to him, if only one of them were to turn away from what they were doing and were to realize the road that I have traveled down and all of the things that I've experienced, but that God took me back anyway, imagine how many people they could save too. And this was the final written interview that we know of from Johnny Cash. His final albums talk about the themes. He covers different singers. His best-known work is called Hurt. It was actually a cover from another singer. But he talks about, in the music video, kind of goes over, it was shot at his home in Nashville, which became the House of Cash, which later burned down. He talked about all of the things that he had accumulated during his life, and that he viewed them all as nothing now, and that they were really meaningless. But that in later songs, he covers another song called Personal Jesus. He talks about how his life was bettered by going back to a relationship with God. And that little 2-room house on his 80-acre property, Cash would go there every day to pray toward the end of his life, the last about 10 years of his life. He had that little 2-room house built on his property. He would go back there every day to study his Bible and pray, because he said, if I don't stay grounded, I could go back exactly to where I have been before. I don't want to go back there. So I'm thankful today for the ministry of James. I wanted to close it up today with also being thankful for the ministry of someone you probably haven't thought about as having a ministry, a man named Johnny Cash. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I thank you for so many people in their ministry of having been broken and coming back to you, and being broken again and coming back to you. And I thank you that so many of us struggle with that. So many of us struggle with just the relationship aspect. You call us into a 100% commitment or a 100% arrangement in a relationship with you. But if we don't hold up our end, you hold up yours and are ready to take us back at a moment's notice. Amen.